Hey, greetings. What are you doing? Grab the microphone first, dummy. It was hard recovering from that injury from those two energy drinks. I accomplished it yesterday by doing something that worked. It didn't take 4,000 milligrams or 5,000. I took 10,000 milligrams, i.e. 10 grams of vitamin C, and man, that made me feel like $1,000,000. It really did. That helped a lot. I love doing videos about topics that nobody talks about on YouTube, specifically in photography, but field theory obviously also. What is the nature of a Goldilocks sensor, as I call it? You know, not too hot, not too cold, just kind of perfect. You know, it hits this this zone. There's that case in optics also. There are these Goldilocks focal lengths, unless they design the lens really bad. Like, for example, 35 millimeter is a Goldilocks focal length. 55 to, not 50, no. 55 to 60 millimeters, roughly right around there, is a magic focal length. Also, too, between 105 and 135. 180 millimeters, 300 millimeters also. These are actually Goldilocks focal lengths for superior and simplex lens design. There's also, too, a Goldilocks zone for sensors. And, of course, the sensor doesn't determine ultimate image output. For example, Nikon D750 and the Nikon D610 are both exactly 100% the same identical sensor, yet they actually have quite different output, and that of course is due to the firmware and the image processing algorithms that go into that camera and its je ne sais quoi of image output straight out of camera. Of course, you should be shooting RAW, so you shouldn't be too concerned about straight out of camera JPEGs, obviously so. But there is a Goldilocks zone for sensors, and it encompasses more than a few different models. I'm not going to name all of them, but I'm going to name the primary ones that really stick out. It is true that and it's the same sensor used in both cameras, more than these two cameras. The XT2 and in the XH1. It's also used in a number of other different Fujifilm cameras. Not anymore, however. There's a Goldilocks zone on the sensors that were used in those cameras and other identical sensors used in Fujifilm cameras. This is just undeniable. It is. In many ways, well, not many ways, but definitely several ways. And people have told me this, and I'll acknowledge it. While this has a better low light performance and better autofocus capability because it is a backside illuminated with phase detect autofocus, it's a superior sensor in basically every way. However, it is the case that that the image output, especially for infrared, and this has to do with pass filters, not the sensor. It is the case, though, that most people, if they have a very discriminating eye, actually prefer the XT2, XH1, so on and so forth sensor. Another Goldilocks zone is a Nikon D4. That camera, I still have two of them. I've owned many of them. The image output from the Nikon D4, due to the pixel pitch, which is really large, and the design, and the sensor is designed and built by Renaissance, that image sensor and its resultant output are absolutely incredible. I can't think of a more pure example of sensor perfection than that of the Nikon D4. Full frame, 16 megapixel, large photo site. You know, it's quite hard to clip the highlights on a Nikon D4. You could do it, but you really have to work at it. You got to be dumb to do it, actually. Another one is the sensor found in the Nikon D610 and Nikon D750. D750 is a failure and I don't recommend it, but it has nothing to do with the image output. And people get confused about that. They say, well, why don't you like the D750? The image output's incredible. I'm like, yes, it is. The camera is a failure, not because of the sensor and its image processing output. The D750 is a failure because it had several recalls and a few design problems, but not because of the sensor. But that is also, too, a Goldilocks zone, if you will, of near perfection. That's found on the D610. D610's got other issues. It spit oil on the sensor, it's got really crappy autofocus, but the image output is incredible. Last but not least, and there are other examples, just not as acute of examples as what I'm listing here, last example, and I have the GF. I was out shooting today with the GFX 100, 102 megapixel backside illuminated, more megapixels, you know, phase detect. You know, the GFX 100 image output is better in every way, empirical every way. But my favorite camera in the whole world is the GFX 50R. That old sensor, and I love it when people say, well, there's an old sensor in the GFX 50S and 50R. Pentac's been using that same damn sensor for years. It's like, this is true, and it still doesn't make any damn difference. The Goldilocks Zone, if you will, on the GFX 50S and 50R, which both use the exact same sensor and image processing algorithms, by the way, is incredible. It's the goal. I've said this for years now, and I'm 100% right, and people are starting to see what I'm talking about. Is that the GFX 50S, 50R image sensors is exactly like a Nikon D5. I told people that that will be the classic Coke, if you will. You know, everybody, when you switch to something new, it's like new Coke. Nobody wanted it. kind of it's a pretty good analogy. But yeah, the 50S and the 50R are incredible. So yes, there are these magical Goldilocks zones of sensors. And they're not like subjective feelings, like, well, you know. Because anybody could say, well, you're smoking crack, because this sensor has got more megapixels, it's faster readout, faster this, and this is true. And yet still, it is the case that the image output and the je ne sais quoi of the XT2, XH1, they're both all the same sensor, including other Fuji, is better in its characteristics. It's kind of like you could find, here's a perfect example, by the way. You could find a more beautiful woman than Cindy Crawford, for example. Yeah, it's just one example. Or Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe had a big mole. What is she, Marilyn? Yeah, a big mole, didn't she? Yeah, big mole. Cindy Crawford's got that same. You need to find a more flawless, beautiful specimen of femalehood than Marilyn Monroe or Cindy Crawford. You know, it's like, wow, that's flawless. It's like, yes, and yet still, and yet still, you know, that's a pretty good analogy. So yes, there are Goldilocks zones and sensors. The number one best Goldilocks zone of all of them, and I've used a lot of cameras. Whether you hate me or like me, you got to admit I have, is the Nikon D4. Second best runner-up of sensor perfection is the sensor that's found in the GFX 50R, 50S. Same sensor been used in the 645 Pentax and other cameras like the X1D Hasselblad. That camera is a failure not because of the sensor. That camera is a failure because the camera is a failure. Poorly designed, issues all over the place. That's what people don't understand. They're like, why don't you like the D750? Because I used to have a D750. I tell them, and they just don't get it. A camera is not a sensor. You know, they could be the best sensor in the whole world in this camera, but if the camera sucks, then I can't recommend it. It's like, well, what's wrong with the D750? The image output is great! It's like, yes, it is! But that the camera itself is a failure. It's kind of like dating the most gorgeous person in the world, but they have, like, incurable venereal diseases and other things you don't want to catch. It's like, oh my God, they're so beautiful. Yes, and still. That is a pretty good analogy. What do you think? I think I hit the nail on the head on that one. Thank you so much for watching. Yeah, I'm glad I could talk about this subject in detail. Peace out, Girl Scout.